Hello, my friends. This is life coach Mike Trugman, and welcome to an episode of Mike's Search for Meaning. I'm after some big questions. Why are we here? What makes a fulfilling life? How can we grow individually and collectively? Each episode, I'll dive deep with leaders who are doing great work in the world and see how they organize their life. Books read, value systems, resources used, and stories that show how each of you can create the life and the world of your dreams. Andrew, welcome to Mike's Search for Meaning, my friend.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I was saying before we jumped on here, it feels like I've spent the entire week with you. We're recording on a Friday here, and I've spent a lot of the week with you watching your talk at Google and other podcast appearances, and you're a really talented writer. And I invited you on because I think that you know a thing or two about what it means to be fully alive, and that's really what this show is about. And one of the things that I think this is probably the only thing I'm going to have a hard time with in this episode, because we're going to get into some sort of flow at some point, but I didn't really know where to begin with you. And I thought maybe one place that would be interesting to start, and it definitely has to do with being fully alive. I was really inspired by your father passed away about a year ago.
Yeah.
And you created this really meaningful container for you to get to know your dad more deeply.
I sure did.
And there was something I don't remember if it was in this email or the newsletter that you sent out, but there was something around, if you want to create a ripple of transformation, or if you want to create healing, start with your family. And so, I would love to hear you talk about what happened with your dad that led to you writing that newsletter.
Yeah. Well, I think it all started with a really important mentor I had in my life named Lauren Zander, who started something called the Handel Method, and is a really exceptional life coach, and was my first mentor in the world of coaching and the transformational arts. And she had this saying that if everyone just took care of their family, we would have world peace. And I was having a conversation with her about 8 years ago. And she was asking me, I was talking about some of my limiting beliefs around financial abundance. And she was asking me these questions about my parents and their finances. And she stopped me as soon as I started talking. And she just looked me in the eyes and she said, "You don't know your fucking parents, do you?" And I immediately recognized in me how I did not know my parents, that I have these deep relationships with so many of my friends and even my coworkers who I know their deepest dreams, what's most challenging in their life, like all about their childhoods and traumas and everything. It's just the depth of relationship that I tend to cultivate with my friends. But I didn't really know any of these things about my parents. And so she challenged me. She invited me to connect with my curiosity for both of my parents and write down every question that I wanted to know about my parents that I did not know. And so that was everything ranging from their favorite memories from childhood to how their parents were, like what are the patterns they adopted from them? Did they have sex when they were married? What was their divorce like? What was it like raising us, the highs and the lows? And did they ever love each other? Because they had a very contentious divorce. And I ended up creating space with both of my parents to just ask them these questions. And I've since written an article about it that's been kind of tossed around quite a bit, that lays out the framework to do this effectively. And so it's not just about asking the questions, but how do you set the container so that they're most available to receive it and answer truthfully. And so I did this with my mom, and already I kind of knew that I was going to be onto something a little bit deeper than I'd anticipated, like learning about previous marriages that I had never heard about, and hearing about some of her traumas growing up with her family members and different things there. And I had a traumatic event when I was in 5th grade where I had something called a psychological out, where I basically kind of faked a mental injury to get out of school for a month during my parents' divorce. And I was talking to her about what had happened in her world during that time. And she really wasn't available to talk about it. And a part of this exercise for me was about just asking the questions that I wanted the answers to and letting them respond in whatever way they were available for. And so I had this conversation with my mom over a week, and then I went and I spent some time with my dad. And again, they had been divorced for quite some time now. And I was, I just had my son Hero. And so while I was having this conversation with my dad, there was something that had happened during the divorce that really led to him hating my mom. And I never really understood why. I just knew why he hated her. And as I was starting to become more aware of my internal world, I wanted him to be able to release that anger that he was holding. I was just curious about it. And so I started to ask more questions about like why this had happened. And I unearthed something that had happened during the divorce that I haven't yet shared publicly. And it made me understand why my dad had some hatred for my mom. And I was able to find some compassion for him in that moment. And when I went to now talk to my mom about this thing, similarly, like wanting her to be able to kind of address, acknowledge, and own some of the things that she had contributed into their divorce, she was also really resistant to talking about it. And if I were to kind of get to where things really start to pick up, is a few years go by and I continue to press my mom on it lovingly. And she finally relents. And what I discover is that my father had a history of child abuse in his previous family. And so then I went through this whole process of talking to the victims who had experienced some of that at the hands of my father to confirm it. And I had one of the victims who requested that I not bring this up with my father, because ultimately I was now on this like quest for truth and real connection with both of my parents. There's this idea that, I now have a son and I want to be able to have the type of relationship where I can be fully honest with him and to feel like we can have that kind of relationship. And to do that, I wanted to have that type of relationship with both of my parents. And so I ended up in a situation which is called triangulation, where you have more than one person who's involved in some sort of traumatic event, and one of the parties is keeping the other person from pursuing any sort of process or clarity or closure. And so the victim requested that I not address this with my father. There was still some entanglements there. And so I ended up allowing that to really just sit there, knowing this with my father, but not addressing it directly because one of the victims had requested me not to do so. And so I honored her request. And then about 2.5 years ago, it was during COVID, I get a call while I'm in New York that my dad was just rushed to the ICU. He has COVID. The doctor says he's not vaccinated. He's about to go on a ventilator. And if he goes onto a ventilator at his age, he was in his mid 80s, he has about a 50-50 chance of making it out. And so I had this really wild moment of knowing that my dad has very likely, I just knew in my heart that he had very likely really never talked to anybody about this abuse that he had perpetrated. And I also had a real hunch after doing more research about abuse that he had also been a victim of it. And he had alluded to that in the past. And so I was confronted with this paradox of, do I honor the request of the victim to not confront him? Or in this moment where my father is very directly confronting death, and more than anything else, if he's going to transition, I want to communicate to him that I know about this part of his life. And that while I don't condone any of the behavior that has happened, I want to let you know that I love you and I see you. And that was where I was coming from. And I felt like there was something energetically for our line moving forward, which we can talk about later in men's work and lineage and how to think about that. And so I wrote out this letter and I made this decision where on the plane, I called the woman. I said, hey, I apologize and I don't expect you to understand or kind of appreciate this, but I need to send this letter to my dad. And so while I was getting onto a plane, I sent both a video as well as a message talking about this as an opportunity for healing in our family and that we can address this with love and honesty and ownership. And when I get to the hospital in Alaska, if anyone was in a hospital during COVID, it was a really weird place. And My dad is in a glass box and he's in a hospital bed and he's barely moving. And I get up and you can't actually go into the room. So I'm just actually talking to him and I have a phone up to my ear. And the nurse gives him the phone and puts it next to him in his head. And I was like, "Hey, Dad, it's me. I'm here. Like, I love you. We're going to be okay." And then I say to him, I was like, "Did you get my letter?" And all he says to me was, "I was going to tell you. I was going to tell you." And he says that twice. And then he essentially just like loses all strength and almost like passes out. And so that was the last thing that I ever said to my dad before he went on to, he was on a respirator, the mask, and then he went on to the vent, which means that they actually have an apparatus that goes down your throat and is breathing for you. And so I was working and basically living in this hospital in Alaska for 3 weeks. And the longer that you're on a ventilator, the less likely your chances of coming back. And so at 3 weeks, like our odds were not great. But ultimately he did come back. And I remember having this moment with him a couple of days after he was able to recuperate. And I just sat on the end of his bed and we talked about everything in the note. And as terrified as I was having that conversation, I almost felt this relief in him being able to finally talk about it and to own what had happened. And when I asked him questions about what he had experienced, I asked if he had experienced any abuse like that growing up. And what I learned was truly some of the most horrific stuff that I've ever heard of in my life, kind of hard to imagine. And so, again, just like more empathy and compassion for what he experienced, and wanted to really present an opportunity for him to take ownership for where he had caused harm, which he fortunately took advantage of and really did to the best of his ability, and was able to rekindle in some ways with some of the people who he had hurt in the past. And he was, I remember in that conversation, he just looked at me at kind of towards the end of it. And he just said, "Who are you? Who does this?" And he just couldn't believe it. And I get goosebumps when I'm saying that. Because I remember that I got back to Austin, Texas, where I live. And I was just thinking about what I'd done. And I was like, wow, this is like the thing I'm most proud of in my entire life. That like I really confronted my own edges, that I fought and stood with this, that I was a stand for truth, that I was a stand for love. And I felt like my relationship with my father was really operating from a place of presence. And the word that I used was clear, that like I had asked the questions I wanted to ask, that I had shared the appreciation I wanted to share. And now, not that there was an absence of challenges, but we were operating and engaging those challenges in the moment, right? Like we had done all that catch up to really get to this place of clear and presence. And so I lost my father last year. He passed away. And we held this ceremony up in Alaska. And I remember I woke up in Alaska the day after his celebration of life. And I just had this like real floaty presence running through my body. And it's just the words that came to my mind were almost funny, but it just said, "Oh, the party's over." But I was just surprised by the stillness that I felt in my body. And it was this awareness that we were clear, that like, would I have loved more time with him? Certainly. But also, a word that you used before is like living all out. But that I spent the time there. I said the things I needed to say. I invited in space for him to take ownership and make amends where, it felt right for the people who were involved. And I'm deeply proud of that journey. Definitely one of the most challenging and most meaningful of my whole life.
Andrew, I'm deeply moved by your share. And if listeners only tuned in for the first 14 minutes, they will have gotten, I believe, a lot out of your share. And thank you. What a courageous act, and what a really just a heroic thing to do. And I can really sense the way that it's the transformation that occurred in your masculine lineage as a result of that, and something that I think about. There's a few curiosities that I would be keen to explore here. And one thing that kept popping into my mind is that there must have been there seems like there was something about Lauren Zander's challenge there. Like, do you know your fucking family? I don't know if were those the exact words?
She wasn't one to ask questions. She was one to tell you how it is. And that's just her approach.
You don't know.
Yeah. She said, you don't know your fucking parents. And I was like, yeah, you're right. I don't.
What was it about that provocation that, I mean, that whole story and of course you were bringing in more to your, it wasn't just like Lauren said that and then, it magically appeared in your life,
yeah.
But like, why do you think that was an effective tool or way to deploy that message that led to you really like getting to this place where you were willing to have these really challenging conversations with your family?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, in terms of like how to deliver a message so that someone's ready to hear it, that's such a dynamic question. And there's so many ways that I could answer it. Why I was able to receive that message from Lauren was because at the time I trusted her. Right. And so I think that that's a really valuable dynamic to have with a coach. And for anyone who wants to work with someone, whether it's a therapist or a coach, is just to ask yourself, like, do I trust this person to reflect me? In all relationships, a great way to think about them is like, the mirror, like I trust this person to reflect me back to me. And at that time, I just really felt like she got me in our first session. I remember just crying because of her ability to see a challenging experience I had in childhood and to reframe it of how that contributed to my personality in ways that I actually valued about myself. And so I just trusted her. And that's why I was really open to receive her feedback and criticism. And I think that a lot of times, asking questions does help people to feel more open to introspecting and looking at themselves. But I think that's the beauty of trust, is that when you trust someone, you're just more open to kind of accepting their word at face value. And I had that relationship with her for a very long time. Yeah.
Might bounce around a little bit here, but I think they're all going to connect in a way. And so I'm finding myself curious. So if your tenor, if I listen to a talk that you gave 4 years ago, there's a different quality to the way, my perception, the story I'm making up over here.
Yeah.
There's a different quality to the way that you talk about connection these days.
Yeah, definitely.
In a pretty short amount of time, you were already being looked at as the Dale Carnegie of the technological age. And so people were looking up to you as an expert on communication.
Yeah.
And there just seems to be just like a real depth to the way that you're speaking to it now. I can't, it's hard to put words to it. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to, like, how did you look at connection a few years ago, and I think also brings us to date around when you were starting to ponder having these types of conversations with your family, and like what shifted in your life in the last few years that's brought you to where you are today?
Yeah. I've always been fascinated with communication and human connection, mostly because I wasn't great at it for most of my early life, right? The reason that I became really interested in these modalities, like certainly I have a mom who is an author and really focuses on the arena of communication, interpersonal dynamics, conflict resolution. And so she's a real wizard in this domain. So I had that around me while growing up, but also I just grew up in Hawaii and I was really lonely for most of my life. And even when I got into high school and college, I was so externally referenced and dependent on external validation to really feel like I was enough. And so I was constantly in this validation seeking loop. And I think that my first and initial approach to communication was so much focused on manipulating externalities. It was about understanding the techniques and the tools and the frameworks of effective communication so that I could get someone to donate to my nonprofit that I started when I was 23, or that I could, tell a story in such a way that I could get someone to give me $1 million for my company, or like I could ask the right questions to help people to feel valued around me so I could build relationships. And so even while I was beginning to achieve success, both relationally and professionally early in my life, I became so dependent on these techniques and tools and processes to mask what was this foundational insecurity and ultimately shame around not feeling like I was enough, not feeling like I was smart. And so I needed to depend on these systems to achieve success. relationally and professionally. And then I had this awakening moment in 2017 at this workshop. It was called Gestalt Communication for Executives. And it's based on Gestalt therapy, Gestalt awareness practice, which is this fairly esoteric now therapeutic modality that was started by this guy named Fritz Perls. And really, like, it was grounded in like how to experience our emotions and our thoughts transparently in the moment and give them a voice. So that's really like what Gestalt was founded on. And so this workshop was all about how to become present to our thoughts and our feelings, to welcome them as real and valid, and to be present and to give those things a voice, to be curious about ourselves and others, and to ask the questions that honor our curiosity. And I remember going into this retreat, which I got to through these really fortuitous circumstances. Someone paid for me to be there because they said that it was something that they thought was important. A random person who I met at a CEO conference paid for me to be at this workshop. So I always think that that's a funny little stroke of luck there, because it really is the foundation of all my work in the transformational arts. And I had this experience early on in this retreat where most of the people who were there were in their 40s and 50s, and mostly C-suite executives. And there was one other person who was in their 20s, and really cool entrepreneur, started a company that a lot of people will have heard of. And I really wanted to forge a relationship with this person or get close. And so I remember making these attempts to connect with her, these little bids for attention and connection, asking her questions, like really trying to dig in. And she was just not having it. And I feel like everyone can relate with that experience of asking someone questions and they're just looking around the room, or they're giving you short answers. And that was certainly what was happening for me. And so when we get into the workshop, the facilitator re-emphasizes those points I just said. Like, who would you be if you allowed yourself to simply acknowledge your thoughts and feelings moment to moment and just spoke transparently to them? And at our first break, this woman was walking outside next to me, and I go to the coffee machine and I'm pouring myself a cup, and she walks over, and I'm thinking to myself, wow, I'm feeling really insecure in this dynamic right now. And I'm noticing that I don't want to try and talk to you anymore. And so rather than hold this story inside, I remember looking at her and I was like, hey, Megan, can I share something? And she said, yeah, sure. And I was like, so I love what you've built. I think that your company is amazing, so much respect for it. And I wanted to share that I have been trying to ask you questions and to connect with you. And I really haven't felt you reciprocating any interest in really having a conversation. I just want to let you know that that's all good. And also, I'm going to stop. And so if you ever want to have a conversation, just let me know, and I'd love to chat. And I'm not sure if have you heard this story? If you're looking at any other podcasts? Okay, great. So she pauses for about a 3 count, and then she just bursts out crying. And she looks at me and she's like, Andrew, this is the last place on earth that I want to be right now. She's like, my boyfriend is breaking up with me. My co-founder is suing me. She's like, this is the last place that I want to be. And in that moment, I remember feeling this electricity. And when I tell the story, I can still feel it in my body, because I compare it to that moment at the end of The Matrix when Neo sees the Matrix for the first time. And he just starts moving slower, and, Agent Smith's bullets are like whizzing by his head. And what my Matrix was this realization that day in and day out, and especially in this moment, like, I was not interacting with reality. I was reacting to this story of what other people are thinking about me and how they're going to respond to me just being honest and truthful. And what I realized is that, yeah, I'm doing that right now with Megan, right? That I was in my head that she's not interested in me, that I'm not cool enough, and I'm going to now retreat from this potential relationship or connection, when she has not been thinking about me at all. She's been thinking about all this other stuff. And I immediately realized that, wow, I'm not just doing that here. I'm doing that everywhere in my life, that I have this unconscious story about how people are going to respond to me, about who I need to be successful. And it keeps me from actually just being who I am, which then begets a bigger question of, well, who am I? And how do I be that person? And ultimately, what I started to practice at this retreat was, it just comes down to really, like, what am I feeling and thinking? And how do I get out of the way and give that a voice? And so I remember going back into that room, and Megan raised her hand when we opened up the circle, and she's like, I have something to share. And she shared what she did with me. She said, I don't want to be here. Like, I don't really get this. And like, I'm dealing with a lot. I don't want to be here. And it's keeping me from being present. And the facilitator very masterfully says, does anyone else not want to be here? Not get it? And two other people raised their hand. They were like, this isn't going to work. Like at my place of work, people aren't emotional. Like this isn't going to be helpful for me. And what I saw was that me being honest created a space where Megan felt she could be honest. That created a space where two other people felt they could be honest. And then the facilitator just says like, well, how many times in your life do you just hold on to what it is that you're feeling because you don't want to be disruptive? You think that you're going to negatively impact other people. And what I felt over the next couple of days was this experience of really removing the mask, allowing myself to be present with what it was that I was feeling and wanted to say. And I found a level of ease and this constriction in my stomach that I carried all the time, even around friends for a lot of my early life, just started to evaporate. And I found that not only did I feel better internally, but the way that people responded to me was akin to the impact and the results that I was trying to manufacture all of my life. That people felt at ease with me, that people trusted me. And it's no, secret. Like, why would they trust me? Well, because they can see that I'm telling the truth, right? And so this really transformed my entire lens on effective communication and connection. That sure, like the techniques and tools of elegant communication, pitching, presentation, those are very real and very helpful. And I can nerd out on those for hours because they're fascinating. But at the end of the day, I think that where we really do start to conjure true confidence, and if it's in a corporate context like executive presence, is when we learn how to connect with our internal experience. We experience and we learn how to express that masterfully in a way that is deeply authentic and that creates space for other people to be authentic as well. And that's such a big piece of how I approach this now. It's sure, I want to feel confident. I want to feel at ease in my body, but also I have this foundational frame that when I am communicating this way with compassion for other people, that I look at you, Mike, and I say like, I want you to feel like you can be totally honest and yourself while you're in my presence. And if I have that desire for you, the only way I believe I can ethically create that space is if I'm doing it first. And I think that this is especially true for other people in our lives, whether those be family members or coworkers who might not have had the opportunities to experience personal development workshops or books that kind of liberate this layer of consciousness, that when we do this with positive intention, with compassion, that it is inherently an act of service for others. And, especially for people who struggle with social anxiety or anxiousness or codependence, oftentimes it's easier to engineer these types of behaviors or authenticity when it's grounded in how it's ultimately of service to the people around us. And that's a frame that I really believe, and that really helps me to operate this way in the world, of just really connecting to what is real, getting over what is right, and trying to give that a voice moment to moment.
Mm-hmm. What are some typical, I know for every person it's a little bit different, but thoughts, feelings, sensations in the body are probably good places to start for what does it mean to connect with your personal truth? Like, how do you know when you're speaking from that place? I know a lot of people who think that they're being honest, and to me, it comes across as a little bit, I don't know if it's scorched earth or abrasive, or there's a different quality to someone who's saying something that they think is true, but that it's like, it's got a forceful energy to it versus a place of truth of like, this is my experience over here. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the difference of those two things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it all begins by learning to articulate what is true for me versus what is true for us. And a lot of times people are presenting stories or perspective as facts. And when we are trying to articulate an idea or an opinion and presenting that as the way that it is, we're very unlikely to be heard, because if we're just sharing our subjective perception, stories, presenting it as facts, And the people that we're talking to are going to do the same thing. They're just going to share their subjective experience of reality and what is. And so one of the most powerful ways to express and practice authenticity is simply checking in with the body and the emotions. And, we think about like how long we existed as like a nonverbal species, truly just like grunting at each other and figuring out like what it is that we needed and how we could support each other. It's like you can communicate quite a lot without words. And, so often we bypass our emotional world and really don't understand or appreciate the value that it has for helping us to connect with people and to influence others authentically. And so it just begins with that process of like, what am I feeling right now? Right. And oftentimes the way to start with that is really just asking myself, like, what are the sensations that I feel in my body right now? And if I start by saying, it's like, oh, I feel like a beating in my heart, like almost like a line in my chest. And like, what's the feeling? What's the emotion behind that? Like right now, I'd say it's for me, it's probably like, feels like gratitude. It feels like love. It feels like excitement. And when I share that, that is in any moment, probably the realest thing that you can share with someone about who you are and what's happening. And what I mean by that is I'll get like a little abstract in this explanation, but I love the question, like, who am I? And what are all of the different ways that we can explore and answer that question? And it's a really fun and valuable pursuit to really consider that. And there's a lot of ways that are valuable to answer that question. Like, what are my values, right? The ways of being I need to express myself. Like, what is my purpose? What am I connected to that's greater? What is my legacy going to be? How do I want to be received? Like after I'm gone, I think of who I am as everything I've ever done, everything I'm doing, and everything I will ever do. Like that is some fun ways to answer, like, who am I? I am these things. And then also, ultimately, those are stories of who we are. The idea that, like, I am these things. Like, those are stories. It's a way I'm trying to describe all these different ways to help you to connect with the I. And so when we look at what an emotion is a state of being. And I have like my emotion grid up here, this thing we give to all the guys in our men's retreats. But so an emotion is a way of being. And humans created emotions as a construct, as a way to articulate our current state of being so that other humans would be more capable at connecting with us and supporting that experience moment to moment. So an emotion is a state of being. And so if I'm going to go ahead and say that that's what an emotion is, and that emotions often imprint onto a physiological process, right? When I feel excited, I might feel flutters in my heart. I feel worried. I feel a pit in my stomach, right? And so if I'm talking to you, Mike, and I tell you that this is the emotion that I'm experiencing and I feel it in my chest, if I'm talking to you, another human, like you have a body, right? And so you can empathize. You can say, it's like, oh, he's feeling something right now in this moment, right? And that this is the word that articulates his state of being, that the furthest away from story that we can get to actually have a conversation. Because again, like the future is the future. The past is the past. We'll only ever have this moment. So the closest I can get to really helping you to connect with me in any moment is saying, this is what I feel, and I feel it here. And there's a lot of other interesting things to talk about, but that foundationally is one of the realest things that we can ever share with someone to truly connect. And then once we're able to connect with those emotions, there's a vast array of directions that we can take a conversation. Oftentimes, if we're navigating challenging emotions or positive emotions, but there's a great concept called needs-based consciousness. And it's the idea that once we start to connect with our emotions, that those are all there because our needs are either being met or unmet. I'll say it one more time, that our emotions are all the product of our needs being met or unmet. right? And so what are some core needs that everyone has? Like recognition, control, safety. And so what we can look at when we feel these things, it's like, oh, I'm feeling worried. It's like, what need is not being met right now? It's like, oh, like I need this talk to go really well. I want to get this money so that I can feel safe. And it's like, okay, great. We're with our partner and I'm feeling like angry. What's the objective thing I needed from my partner in that moment that's making me feel angry right now? And when we're able to start to think about the needs that have created our challenging emotional experiences, we're more capable of now taking ownership for our reality and our relationships to tell people, hey, could you do this next time so that I don't feel this way, right? This is at work in any relationship. And so it's a powerful way to start to take ownership over our lives and our relationships. When we can feel our feelings, we can get curious about like what needs are not being met that create those. And then we can move kind of out of the victim mindset into the architect mindset of actually asking people for those things that we need to cultivate the emotional experience that we desire.
Hmm. A lot of what you're speaking to, it reminds me of Gay Hendricks' work around speaking unarguably. And I'm sure you're familiar with this, but I think the three ways that he says to speak unarguably are to share, if it's a thought, you start with, I'm having the thought that, but you can't really argue with that, right? If you're just saying I'm having the thought, it's not the story anymore. It's just you naming the thought.
Yeah.
I'm having the feeling that, and naming your feeling, or I'm having the sensation in my body. That would, man, this is a big edge for me. It would eliminate a lot of drama in my life. And I think one way to maybe make this even realer is for me to bring some of my own stuff into the conversation.
Yeah,
I love doing this. And yeah, like I mean, if we're just working in the here and now, right now, I get nervous before pretty much every podcast I do. I don't know. There's something about you that I really want you to like me. Like you're like a few years my senior. I am having the thought that you're like where I want to be in 5 years. When I listen to you talk 5 years ago, I'm reminded of where I'm at right now, and I'm like finding myself curious about what it would look like for me to be a version of Andrew Horn in 5 years from now. And yeah, I'm having the thought, I'm making up the story that my desire for you to like me is in some ways like it's blocking a little bit of the connection that might be possible.
Yeah.
And also my genuine open-ended curiosity that I'm able to bring into a lot of my conversations. It's like, I'm good at it, but it's like, I'm efforting curiosity a little bit.
Well, so what I can share is that when you share that, I sense realness, and like what I notice in my body is that like I notice my body light up in my chest, and I notice myself lean in, and I got curious, and I was like, "Are you open to like workshopping that?"
I am.
Cool. So I just got off with a client this morning, and I've been using this metaphor a lot recently. But first, it's just to have compassion for this foundational process of mind. And, I often think of, for anyone who hasn't read Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, it's such an incredible book. And when he talks about the evolution of man, he says that like the core process that distinguishes man from any other species is our ability to tell stories. That is how we were able to evolve. And he gives this example of, early Homo sapiens walking in the jungle, and they see tall grass, and someone says to the person walking next to them, "Don't walk there. There's a tiger behind the tall grass." Right? Our ability to tell the story that there is danger lurking in that hidden place is what allowed us to feed the base human desire for survival. By telling our minds, making up the story that there is danger, we are able to avoid danger. And so what I often just remind people is that when we have these stories about the worst case scenario happening, it's that this is this foundational process of mind of what makes us human. And so if we can almost like have like humor or laugh at it without allowing it to get so personal, but that this is like the mind doing what the mind has done for as long as we have been humans. And we can start from that place And then when we really start to integrate the thoughts consciously, are you familiar with Byron Katie and the work?
Yeah, but go ahead and lay it out.
Yeah. So for those who aren't familiar with it, so we just invited in a story, a thought, right? And so the thought is that I really want Andrew to like me, right? And is that the thought, or is the thought that I won't like you?
Well, the thought is that I want Andrew to like me, and there's fear, right? That the fear is that you won't like me.
So the thought would be like, Andrew might not like me.
Or maybe even to paint a more colorful picture, that it's, well, Andrew, I have a chance here to be impressive to Andrew and be the best podcast interviewer ever that he's experienced. And I want Andrew to really have this amazing experience. And he's going to maybe find out that I'm not so good after all. That would be the fear.
And what's the emotion that's present right now as you speak to it?
Well, I notice the fear lightens. Like there's a lightness that of just speaking it out loud and stating what is true to me, that I feel a little bit more relaxed. But there's fear, and there's a little bit of shame too. A little bit of shame of like, Mike doesn't feel confident enough to be able to just without fear have a conversation with another guy that intellectually he knows he belongs with, but it's still got more work to do, Mike. So a little bit of shame there too.
Yeah, totally. And so are you open to welcoming those in and letting them be part of our conversation? Mm-hmm. Cool. So where do you feel the fear?
Well, I notice my shoulders are hiked up a little bit. My palms are sweaty and my heart is beating fast. My jaw's clenched a little bit. So there's a little bit of just a constricting energy in my body, like a tightness.
And so we'll workshop this in a way where we're leading Mike into his process, but also I'll contextualize kind of what's happening. And so we just like got present to, okay, so I'm feeling the fear in the body, feels like a constriction. And then we're just like a big part of developing our relationship with the emotions is just learning how to have a more constructive conversation. And so once we get present to an emotion, one of the most helpful things we can do is to simply get curious about it. And so as you become present to that fear, I'm curious, is it a familiar fear?
Very much.
Very much so. How long have you carried this fear with you?
Really almost as long as I can remember. I mean, there's a couple of memories that come up, and I've looked at these memories several times before, but they still, that's it. I guess maybe I'm already noticing some judgment coming in. Like I've worked on this already, but I'll speak to the memories. Like there was one time that I was reading in front of my class, and I forget exactly how old I was. I was probably in 6th grade, and I mispronounced the word chic, CHIC. I said chick, and one of the most popular girls in my school laughed at me, and I felt immense embarrassment, and just didn't. Exposing myself felt really hard there, and I, in some ways, internalized like my fear. My fear is telling me, "Don't do that. It's scary. Exposing yourself, you might get laughed at."
Yeah. So the message, like in that moment, was, "Don't expose yourself. You might get laughed at, humiliated in public." And so that's just one memory. So just like tapping back into the fear that you feel in this moment. And a lot of times for people who are even doing this like on their own with something they're navigating, like oftentimes it can be helpful to close your eyes if you're if you're diving into an internal experience and the emotions like this, but whatever feels natural to you. And so just noticing that fear, how is it present in your body now? What are you noticing?
I'm more in like more upper body now. Like there's a tightness in my face. My face is scrunched, and so some warmth.
Same thing. Let's just go ahead and with each breath, just welcome in the fear with that awareness of how long it's been present. One of my favorite concepts when it comes to navigating the emotions is the idea that there is no enemy in the emotions. It can often feel like they are enemies that are hindering us, holding us back. But something that's really helpful to engineer that curiosity with the emotions is the idea that there's no enemy in the emotions. And so I'm curious, like, does this fear that you feel in this moment that you've held in, does it have a purpose?
It wants to keep me safe.
So the fear wants to keep you safe. And so if you were to speak to the fear, and I'll invite you to use the word you, really identifying it as a part. Yeah. If you were to just like allow the fear to be recognized for its purpose, that you hear it, why it's here, what would you say to it?
Yeah, I would thank it for, like, I feel immense compassion for my fear right now, and that there's a real beauty in the way that it serves to protect me and to keep me safe. And I really appreciate you, fear, for protecting me. And there's this recognition. Would you be willing to take a step back and see what might emerge in this conversation with Andrew that I'm really enjoying, and I feel like I could even enjoy more if I'm able to be fully present to him right now.
And I love how you went into like a possibility and a curiosity. And so one thing that's oftentimes helpful is to speak to the emotion and to really ingrain into that experience, like fear. So I get that you are trying to protect me, and I really appreciate you. And if you were to speak to the fear and let it know how it impacts you in the moment, how it impacts you in conversations on podcasts, if you were going to speak to the fear and let it know how it impacts you, what would you say to the fear?
This feeling of safety and connection is another really big one for me. So safety and connection, that you are guarding for me, which I appreciate that you are guarding for me. They feel even more available if, it doesn't need the guarding. Like, if I'm fully here with Andrew, then that's the safety and the connection feels fully possible. And that's what we're exploring here, being fully alive.
And I think that what I really appreciate what you did there, it's like a lot of times we want to tell our emotional experience that like it's going to be different, of like, you don't need to be here. And like what I often invite people to just consider for a moment is that the challenging emotions that we experience, again, that there's no enemy in the emotions, is that their intention is good. But just like we've explored, is that the mind will naturally wander to the worst case scenario, what we don't want to have happen, so that it does not, which imprints onto our emotional experience. But that the motivation that we have received from these challenging emotions, which is right now we're talking about fear, we can get into shame as well, which is a huge one, especially for men, that those emotions have provided a lot of energy and motivation to take action. And so we think about like how those have been of service, that it's almost a form of self-abandonment in a way, to just say, I'm not going to feel afraid anymore. I'm not going to feel shamed, because that feels like it's abandoning this foundational motivational mechanism that has allowed us to get to wherever we are, whatever station of life that we're in. And so what I'll oftentimes remind people of like, and even in this moment, is to think of like, okay, if this has provided some motivation to act, like, where do you want to motivate from? And if you're speaking to the fear, so when I show up in conversations, like, you've helped me to prepare, you've helped me to be present, to think about my guests, but also what would it be like? I want to see what it's like to motivate from. And how would you answer that question?
My heart.
Oh, how does it feel when you say that?
Empowering. Like I felt myself slightly. I mean, if you're watching on video, I kind of puffed out more than what it really felt like. But there was a setup straighter.
Go into the body, and what do you notice in your body when you say that, from my heart? What do you feel?
Yeah, I feel the power in my heart. I just feel a rock sturdy thudding.
And now from this place, just welcome in the experience of all of it, of allowing yourself to contain the multitudes of the power that you feel in your heart, the constriction of the fear, and just allow all of those to be present, to notice it. Like, you can hold all of those at the same time. And also, if you were speaking from that space of the heart, the power, and you were just going to relay, does it have any sort of message for the fear or the shame? What does it want to say?
Yeah. I'm well aware that I'm on a podcast right now, and there's a temptation to just jump in, but I'm just sitting with, but I'm waiting for something to just feeling into it right now still.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it's also okay if there's no message. What are you present to in your body?
Yeah. I mean, there's like more of a stillness to the heart thud. So maybe a grounded and expansive energy at the same time.
Totally. And so what I'll invite in here is, just for anyone who's listening again, it's before we started the podcast, I think I was talking about this frame that I really love about how what we don't own owns us. And so for anyone who's experienced any kind of social anxiousness, some fear, some shame stories of not enough, whatever that might look like, that there are really like no frames or techniques that are going to help you to integrate that experience if we're unwilling to fully own what is. And again, if we're experiencing challenging emotions, we can start by just welcoming those in, like you just did with the fear, by kind of really speaking to it directly. If I'm not going to motivate from fear, which is the easiest and most accessible place of motivation for so many people, the base of the brainstem, but where you just talked about, it's like from my heart, from love, like that's when we start to move up. And when we can speak to the emotions and say like, hey, there might be another way that we can do this. And like, can we just try? You don't even have to say it's like, it's going to be so much better. You don't know. Maybe you believe that. That's fine. But also you can start to use it as an experiment of like, hey, I want to see what is it like if I come in and I'm really just leading from my heart and full presence. And like, what would that feel like? And so you would just start. And that's like a beautiful kind of example of what an emotional process can be like. And then if we start by just feeling the feelings fully, then we can move into like, okay, when we have a feeling, it's almost certainly going to imprint onto a thought, right? This is what we would call a psycho-emotional loop. I feel this feeling, and then that feeling imprints onto a thought. And so we feel the feelings, and then we can also become present to the thought. And so the thought, oftentimes, like the mind is really good at speaking hyperbolically and like in superlatives. And so it's like, if you were just like, oh, I really want Andrew to like me, like we can have that. But the fear is probably a product of you actually being worried that I won't have the experience that you want, right? And that's what I mean is that, so because if there wasn't that unconscious like worry or fear, then if you're operating from curiosity typically shows up, right? More like an excitement than an anxiety. And so let's just go ahead and play with like that, which is just maybe a small part, but like that Andrew won't like me or like think positively of the podcast, right? Does that feel somewhat true? Like maybe just a little bit?
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. So, and just, this is again, a really powerful framework by a woman named Byron Katie, who still teaches out of Ojai. I highly recommend anyone who has an opportunity to work with her, go and do that. But anytime we have a challenging thought, you can just ask these 4 questions and a turnaround. And so the thought would be like, Andrew's not going to like me. Okay. So that's the thought. And then I would ask Mike 4 questions. The first question is that true? Andrew's not going to like me.
And I know the 4 questions, but I'll play along. What if I'm like really entrenched in this? I'm going to say, yes, it is true. He'll see that I'm an incompetent interviewer. He's not going to like me.
And second, is there any way that you can 100% for certain know that this is true? There's no. So we just identify with those 2 questions that this is a thought that we can't know for certain is going to be true. And then the third question is really important again, where we start to speak to the emotions and we show them how it's impacting us in reality, which is, Mike, when that story is present, how do you respond or feel? So when you have this thought, you accept it as true. How do you feel? How do you respond? What's your answer?
I feel the fear. I feel constricted. I feel tight. I feel I've got like a tunnel vision way of just like getting through the moment and instead of being connected to something bigger or more possible.
Constricted, limited in my vision. So what's so important about that third question is what we identify there is that this thought, which is not true, is having an actual impact on my reality. So the thing that is not real is creating and engineering an undesired feeling or state that is real. So that's a crucial part of this process, and to start to really integrate and address our thoughts consciously. And so then the fourth one is like, let's just imagine that thought, Andrew doesn't like me, is a line of code in your brain computer. And I'm a hacker and I come in there and I just, and I delete that line of code. So that thought doesn't exist. So if you don't have that thought, how do you feel showing up on the podcast?
I notice if I delete that thought that I'm just like available. I'm really available and free.
Yeah. And then we go into our turnaround, which is, could the opposite be true? Could Andrew really like me?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I would say
I'm believing that Andrew really likes me right now, actually.
I do. I'm really enjoying you and liking you in this conversation. And so what I would say is that this formulaic process is incredibly powerful for anyone who has looping thoughts in your life. And again, like where these typically happen is tied to shame, feelings of not enoughness, unlovability, financial scarcity, intelligence, beauty, physical aesthetics. It's that if you have these types of loops, that there's really no amount of work that's going to help you to integrate those without addressing the thoughts and choosing to consciously integrate them, because you will have them over and over again. One of the most powerful pieces of work that I still do to this day, and that I learned from Lauren Zander, was this thing called the thought journal. And it's literally looking at like, what are the stories, the limiting beliefs that I have about myself, how people receive me, how I'm received in the world. And I would keep a journal for a week where every single time I would have that thought, I would have to write it down. So I had a catalog of the most prevalent, and I would have to mark it off. And I would notice how often I have those thoughts. And there's that great Anais Nin quote that we don't interact with reality as it is. We interact with it as we are. And that so much liberation and freedom exists in just inspecting the mind and how it naturally operates and choosing to integrate those thoughts. Because then what happens is that we can come back to presence, where we can start to interact with objective reality. And then rather than motivating from fear, from shame, we can start to motivate from these other places, which is really exciting. And a big part of my process is that it's not only about, deconditioning the unconscious self, these thoughts that imprint onto our way of being, but then it's like, well, wait a second, who am I? And how do I want to be in this moment, right? Before I do any podcast or really like any high stakes conversation, I'll check in with myself and I ask that question, how do I want to be, right? So I know that when I'm here, like I want to be present, I want to be focused, and I want to be real. Like those are just like three that come to mind. And just by pointing my mind to here's how I want to be for this conversation to be enjoyable, interesting, inspiring, exciting, like those are three pillars of awareness that I can focus on. And so I'm just more likely to be able to create the experience that we want. When I know that my core values as a human are curiosity, authenticity, love, novelty, right? Like these different things, then I can just, well, in any moment where I'm like, how could I be more curious? How could I be more authentic? How could I be more loving? What would it look like to speak from that place, to act from that place in this moment? And so we can start to internally reference our sense of self and also our decisions and our actions in the world. And that's where you really start to create reality on your own terms. There's a great frame within conscious leadership, and it says that there's the to me frame and the by me frame, right? And there's that shift of like, okay, things are going to happen in the world, but what do I control? My response is, what I control. It's Viktor Frankl says, it's like, there is a space between stimulus and response. In that space is our ability to choose our response. And like in that space is where we like direct our lives.
Yeah.
So thank you for opening up and being willing to like go in and to share that. And I feel more connected to you. And I'd share that again of like where so much of this came from is that, those thoughts of social anxiety and not belonging. Like one of the biggest stories that I was able to really like integrate in a big way recently was this idea that the men who I looked at as supremely successful or famous or whatever it was, that those people didn't respect me at the same level. Mm. And like whatever that even means, their level, right? Some abstract, but it was just this shame story and then I looked around and I was like, looked at who my friends are. And I was like, wow, the people that you have the story about are your friends. And it just was a moment where I was able to even look at like, look at where I have this story, because this is what is motivating me to like try and like seek belonging and be more present. And it was just like, I don't want that anymore. And more than like, I think that the amount of people who say that they experience social anxiety consistently is like over 50% of young people. And so 5% of people have a social anxiety disorder that's overwhelming and they can't really operate, but everyone experiences social anxiety. It's like the mind's natural way to prepare us. It's like some of us just experience it more than others. And those who are willing to actually own, that I have social anxiety and I'm dealing with it consciously, that's where confidence stems from.
Yeah. Well, thanks for taking me in. I mean, I feel a lot more present and available and connected here as well. So there were so many things in what you just shared. I think on a practical level, it could be helpful. You referenced that you have a map of the maybe emotions and where they're typically experienced. And yeah, you looked up to your right over there. Do you have it handy of if someone's listening and they're curious about just getting, I think the basics are really essential. And I actually, some more of my conditioning here is like, I've heard the conscious leadership group model of like where emotions are in the body. And then I start to make up that I should be past that and I should be onto more complex emotions. But the basics can really go a really long way. And I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit of a map that everyone, of course, is a little bit different, but maps and models can be helpful too.
Yeah. And I'd say the one thing, it's if we think about so much dissatisfaction, like foundationally in our life, it's because we're telling ourselves that we need to be other than we are. And it's like when I think of like reactivity in the body, it's like we're telling ourselves that I need to be other than I am. And so what's interesting is that if I'm feeling reactivity, it's like I'm telling myself that I shouldn't have this emotion, that this means that I am not confident, like whatever it is. And so it's just interesting to know. It's that if we're in a state of reactivity, we're telling ourselves that we need to be other than we are, and that the pathway is allowing ourselves to be what we are in that moment fully, is that is where we allow it to move. And then again, like what we don't own owns us. And so just a helpful frame. And so, I do it. If you just Google Junto emotion grid, you'll get the list of emotions. And I think that, we do these long integrations after our retreats, and I'll encourage the men to wake up and go to sleep every night. And they share, my name is Andrew, going to sleep, feeling X and my Y. And just like actually like introducing a way of being that is more grounded in awareness of our emotions. And again, like when we're more aware of our emotions, we're more aware of looking at like where my needs are or are not being met. And then we're more capable of taking action to create the reality that we really want.
Shame is a huge one.
Yeah.
And especially for men, as you said, what are some of the stories that you see men mostly carrying around with shame?
Yeah. I mean, I actually have a post that is going out on a couple of platforms today, which is on the really important distinction between shame and guilt. And it's really essential in my mind. And so quickly, I'll break down my understanding and interpretation of shame and guilt, because shame and guilt feel very similar in the body, right? It's shame and guilt, like oftentimes for a lot of people, show up as a real constriction or pit in the stomach. And guilt, I understand as the belief that my actions are out of alignment with who I am or my values. So it's a recognition of something that has been done or not done that is out of alignment with who I know myself to be. So that's guilt. And so guilt can be a very productive emotion. It helps us to bring awareness. So it's like, I might have done something that I shouldn't have, or I didn't do this thing. And that actually doesn't align with the type of person that I think I am. And so guilt, while challenging, can often be very illuminating to directing our behavior where we want it to go. Shame sounds a lot more like a hyperbolic assessment of our identity and who we are. It sounds much more like the stories of I am not enough, I'm not lovable, I am not attractive, I will never be financially free. And that this shame, again, has been a foundational fear source of motivation for so many people for so long. And again, it's impossible to overcome the shame story by action. If we have the story, and that's a really important thing to say, it's that we will not overcome shame ever with just action. We have to address the thought itself, which is what it is. I am not enough. I am not lovable. Because if we continue to be successful into a container where I am not enough, that success may help us to feel some reprieve in the moment, but it's still happening within the story, the frame that I'm not enough. And so when we look at those stories like shame of like, what is it that most men hold? I actually don't speak to a generality, but it is just present. And Brene Brown has a great quote. She says, shame dies in sunlight, but it is also the last emotion that anyone wants to share, wants to talk about, which is why I see such great courage in you for being willing to share that in front of your audience, right? It's because the shame says that I am not enough, I'm not smart, but that if other people know this, that the story will become true, right? That this is like, if people know that I'm not enough, I'll be found out, I'll be discovered, when the exact opposite is true. When we actually speak to it, when we express it, we're more capable of recognizing that it is just a story, right? That it's, again, the thought that we are having. And so I really do recommend that shame is such a sensitive one, and that, you know, I don't recommend that people walk around and becoming a fire hose of shame that they're talking about with everybody. But whether it's with a trained professional, whether it's in a support group, whether it's with your closest friends, it's really starting to just address, like, what are these stories that I have hyperbolically about who I am, about how other people perceive me? And the first step to integrating any of this stuff is simply becoming aware of it. So it's like the first step to integrating shame is becoming aware of it, is giving yourself the time to say, it's like, and I have an exercise that's available online that's called the social identity, that really helps us to identify what are these shame stories that have, you know, created our construct of reality, our social world. And once we become aware of those stories, the same way that we used the work, right? It's like now we can start to address those shame stories for what they are, which is a story. We can integrate that, right? We can start to actually process the emotional side of it the same way that we just did before that. But I think that that is, you know, one of the most challenging to deal with, and ultimately one of the most toxic, because when we're not able to experience and express that emotion, the founder of Gestalt therapy, this guy Fritz Perls, he would say that, you know, we have this rich emotional world, and when we don't express, we suppress. And when we suppress, things will simmer, and they will get to these little moments where we act out, or maybe we snap at someone, or we get into a fight, or we get addicted to drugs. But then it will get to a boiling point where something really bad happens, where we explode. And so that's why I think that this process of consciously integrating shame is not just about us feeling good, but it really is an act of service to society at large. And I think that, you know, if you look at the modern men's movements of the past 70 years, from like, you have really the mythopoetic men's movement of, you know, the 60s and Iron John and the will to change, and really, which is a response to second wave feminism, right? Is that because what happened is you had so many women who were rightfully, you know, taking their place at the table in the boardroom and politics. And so these really rigid gender roles in society of like, men provide and make money and work. And then the lines about those rigid gender roles started to get blurred. And so there was this identity and this shame around really this shifting role. And so I think that so much of, you know, the mythopoetic men's movement was creating spaces where men and society at whole could inspect the totality of their identity, shame for how that was growing. And I think in our generation, I refer to this as a second wave men's work, right? Like so many of the men who are like doing incredible work in the world right now. But if you were talking about men's work in 20, like it wasn't a thing. There weren't articles, there weren't people on talk shows or like with Oprah, but like really like that became more prominent on the heels of another really catalytic cultural event, which was Me Too. And I think that you look at so many people becoming aware of the abuse that so many women had experienced. And I think that that's case in point, the type of explosion of rage or physical harm that can emerge when people don't have spaces to integrate their challenging emotions. And shame is just one of the most toxic emotions, the most difficult to talk about. And so being able to create spaces where men can integrate that consciously is, not only an act of service to themselves and the people they care about, but society at large. And I think a really essential process of modern men's work.
Yeah. So something that you're speaking to here that I'm in touch with on a regular basis is that if I look globally, a lot of the wounding is perpetrated by men. And what I would say is by the men that are doing the wounding, there are all sorts of unfelt, unlooked at, unresolved stuff internally. And shame is probably a really big one. And that's not to excuse any of the behaviors in any way, but it's to say that, man, I think if a lot of the best coaches were able to get their hands on working with someone like a Donald Trump, and Donald Trump was willing to take an honest look at himself, that a lot of these like narcissistic, really hurtful behaviors would, at the very least, start to get examined, and at the very best would be released. And then we would be able to see, like, I fundamentally believe that at our core, I don't know if I'd be able to show up to this podcast or my life with any sense of optimism if I didn't believe this to be true. That I believe that at our core, beneath all of our stories, beneath all our wounding, we all really want the same kind of basic things. We want connection, we want belonging, we want safety. And so, yeah, I'm wondering maybe if you want to riff on this at all. I was also sitting with this curiosity of, like, what does it mean right now? It's an evolving question, just like who am I is an evolving question. It's not something that you just figure out and then it's static for the rest of your life. So what's your best attempt at speaking to what it means to be a man in 2024, in April of 2024 right now?
Yeah, so I have a pretty strong belief about this, that it is kind of a fool's errand to determine like what it is, what masculinity is on a societal level. I think that the exploration of masculinity is really essential, but on an individual and communal level. And what I mean by that is that, like, the definition of masculinity is a collection of traits, values, and characteristics that we associate with the experience of a male, right? And so the idea that any one person or entity can say that this is what healthy, this is what like unhealthy masculinity is, that for younger people, like, it can be helpful to say, like, here are behaviors that socially, like, we can, for the most part, agree on, to have some frameworks like that. But I think that especially as you start to get more to adults, and which I'll speak to, that what is helpful is to create space where we can start to look at what is masculinity to me, right? What are the characters, traits, and behaviors that I associate with the conscious, healthy expression of masculinity? What are the characteristics, traits, behaviors that I associate with the unhealthy expression of masculinity? And then what I would also implore pretty much anyone who's doing this type of masculinity or femininity work to do as well is ask themselves, what does the healthy exploration of femininity looks like in me? What is the unhealthy expression of femininity in me? Because, like, what's more important and more interesting to me, I won't say important, I'll say what's more interesting is not like, what does it mean to be a man, but it's who am I? And to get closer to that question, like, you and I are both males, right? Like, we have felt societal pressure to express these ambiguous values and characteristics that we associate with the experience of a male, because we wanted people to view us as a man, the man. And so there's a lot of just unconscious conditioning that exists there. And so what we can do is really start to consciously integrate these characteristics and values and say, oh, like, this is my relationship consciously to masculinity, to femininity. Here are the parts of that I want to express to be me, who Mike is, right? And I oftentimes say, it's like we are working with man to connect more deeply to the human and, like, just who you are. And so what's nice is that, really rigid gender roles played a really important role in society for a long time. And this is where Warren Farrell is someone who I had on my podcast a while back. He's a controversial figure, but I actually found him to speak quite eloquently about this, that in early civilization, right, you needed rigid gender roles between men and women because it was just a much more archaic time where you actually needed men to step into the responsibility of protecting in that environment and women to be in the role of nurturing because war was much more common. Right. And so having these rigid gender roles allowed people to more easily opt into the role that was required for society to flourish. And then, as we kind of step more into modern times, the rigid gender roles were no longer really like protecting. It was more about providing. And it wasn't about necessarily warring as much as it was about providing financially. So that was providing security. Whereas, the feminine women were nurturing. And then you get into this time where now like those rigid gender roles like still have a place, but they don't need to be as rigid, right? Like you can have women in the military, you can have women in the boardroom, and then you can have stay-at-home dads, and like that can be what people want to express. And while I do think that there are some similarities like in the experience of a man and a woman, that the women are just inherently going to be more drawn to relational pursuits than people in male bodies. Like there's a lot of genetics that speak to that, like hormonally, of like what types of activities trigger the hormones that decrease stress, but also like we can allow for more fluidity there. And so what I think is helpful is that people are inspecting their own sense of masculinity and doing that in a community of other people who are asking themselves the same question, and that you can provide a community of people who are reflecting and holding each other accountable for being that type of person in the world. So I think that being a man in 2020 is a privilege and an honor, and that there's a lot of opportunity to do really beautiful work and to uplift other people and to be exactly who you are, more so than at any other time in history, and that we should take advantage of the opportunity and help as many people as possible to ask these types of big questions about who they are and who they want to be in the world and what gets in the way, and just help people as much as possible, as much as we're called to.
It's a deeply personal question, and I love. I mean, that's really the main theme. That it's like another way of asking, who am I, and like what does masculine energy in me look like, and what is unhealthy masculine energy, what's healthy feminine energy. And I don't think I've heard it quite put that way before, that it was in a way, it was very helpful historically to have more clearly defined gender roles, and that we just live in a time that allows for more fluidity, which can be tricky and also really beautiful.
Yeah, which is why masculinity and femininity work becomes really important, because it's like those rigid gender roles, well, important in some ways, but they were restricting our freedom about who we can be. Whereas now we have, a lot more freedom to be whoever we want. So it's really important to think about like who I am and what is actually meaningful to me on my own terms. And that's what I mean is that, like I for one am like really, I don't lean towards archetypal wisdom or, frameworks about like who I am as a person and who you are with like numbers and different things. I do think that models can be helpful for accelerating our thinking and ability to understand things. But it's like an example of this would be that, it's a friend of mine is this guy, John Wineland, and it's his birthday today. And like he's a student of David Data, and like he speaks to like much more traditional masculine, feminine, spiritual archetypes. And he speaks to that because for a lot of people, they find a great deal of value and liberation in someone who is creating a system and articulating like what is masculine and what is feminine, and that it resonates for a lot of people. And I think that that's what's helpful, is just coming to like that there's no divine truth that this is masculine, this is feminine, but there are people who do articulate different frameworks that they believe to be helpful. And that's what's powerful. It's like when people are like, oh, like that helps me to be me. Right. And so I'm going to double click there, but that we don't delude ourselves in saying that, like, again, like the same way that any religion would be, that this is deified or the way to think about that in the world.
So Andrew, there's two things that I would love to get to with you in the next 20 minutes or so that we've got remaining here. One is just around our relationship with technology. And I wrote in all caps, digital intimacy on my page here, because I love I would love for you to explain what that is. And we also want to get into relational leadership. And that's what I always ask in the intake form. What's one question you would love to be asked? And the question that you wrote is, what is relational leadership? And I know that you're creating a whole business around relational leadership. And so whichever direction you feel called to, those are the two directions that I would love to go at the back end here.
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, when I think of digital intimacy, I've spent the last 10 years building this company called Tribute, which is, if you imagine waking up on your birthday and 30 of your closest friends and family members have sent you a 1-minute video telling you why they love you, that's a tribute video. And we spent quite a lot of time building that, putting it into the world. We've delivered more than 6 million of these videos in like 90 countries or something like that. And so I think a lot about like how technology can truly help our relationships, and time well spent, a term that my friend Tristan Harris frequently talks about. But for me, digital intimacy is really just asking ourselves the question of, how does technology, and specifically social media platforms, genuinely improve and enhance my feelings of intimacy and connection with the people in my life? And that, it's really easy to just, I think, diminish the value that social media platforms have in our lives, because there are really nefarious incentives at play that do, the companies are incentivized to promote content that just speaks directly to the bottom of the brainstem, that speaks to outrage, to, just like entertainment that is not necessarily beneficial for our well-being, and especially for young people. And there's a lot of data to back that up, so that while there are a lot of troublesome and problematic aspects to the algorithm and those platforms, what I do speak to as well is that for people who are going to use these platforms consistently, and who are adults with a little bit more capacity to discern, their well-being and using these platforms, that there are ways to use them where they truly do make your life better. And, where you have really clear agreements about how to use these things, like anything. Like, I've used tobacco at different periods in my life, and now I very rarely use it, but I do have really clear agreements around it, where I enjoy tobacco like 4 weeks of the year. Like, I have these specific trips where I can do it. And I just know that I don't do it outside of those 4 weeks, because I really enjoy it too much and it doesn't make me feel good. But I can enjoy it for 4 weeks of the year, and I just love it. It's a fun substance, And so, great. Same with social media. It's like, when I'm on that platform, it's like, I need to know really clearly, hey, how much time a day is my cutoff? And create clear agreements with myself to make sure that I'm honoring those. And then also, one of the biggest ones for digital intimacy is just, am I just browsing or am I engaging? And what I always say to people, especially if you are a content creator, I think that this is essential. But if you are creating content and that's a part of your livelihood or just your craft, your art, and you're not actively liking or commenting on the stuff that you enjoy, what are you doing? Like, you're acting in such a way that you don't want other people to engage on your content. And I think that simple thing, which is that, like, I always make a point, that's like the one behavior that I would look at to cultivate more, which is, if you like something, like it. And if something speaks to you, make a comment. Because for me, like, there are people who I really enjoy, and I just make an effort to comment on that, because I know that even in some small way, that makes it human. And it's going to, and there's research around this, that if you're using social media for an hour a day and you're just browsing, for sure, there's going to be a decline in your subjective well-being. But if you're actively liking content and commenting or messaging with people, and you're on for an hour in a day, there's a lot of research that shows that you can have a subjective increase in your well-being. And so it just comes down to, like, am I just browsing or am I engaging? And if you're going to be on it, most of us have a conflicted relationship with social media. You can make it better by just engaging and making a conscious decision to do so.
And I would add, and I want to get into relational leadership, but and this is something that I heard you speak to, that active browsing or active engagement on social media isn't, to me, I see a lot of people make comments like, such a great post, or, like something that you could write in passing. But really, I would encourage, this is big for myself too, is that if you're engaging, for it to be more thoughtful than just really great or enjoyed reading this, and like really engaging with, how were you moved by this, or how were you impacted by the thing? is, or who else would really enjoy, who else would get a kick out of reading this, who else would learn something from reading this, is a way to really hone in on your engagement and not just make it another thing of like, all right, I need to like 5 people's posts today. So I just wanted to throw that in there quickly.
Yeah, I love that.
So relational leadership is the last thing I wanted to get to. And I know this is something that's taking up a lot of your consciousness these days. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to relational leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. So the relational leadership is really kind of going to be the next chapter of my life. I'm really excited. I've created some space to launch my next company. And so it's called the Institute for Relational Leadership. And relational leadership as a modality is, I just think of it as the essential relationship skills for conflict resolution, clear communication, meaningful conversation, and collaboration. And it's like, what are these 4 aspects of communication that I feel are essential for any individual or team member? And as a modality, like what I believe is that investing into the quality of our relationships, which I would define as really a feeling of meaningful connection, which I can define here, and presence, full presence with that person, is one of the most meaningful pursuits that we can invest in to become the best version of ourselves and create success in the world. That for us to exist in a place where all of our important relationships are operating from a place of true presence and meaningful connection, that we are going to create a level of harmony and efficiency at work that is inevitably going to lead to the best version of ourselves and the most impactful version of any sort of business or, team that we're working on. And so I think what's fun is like, I've always just been enamored with like what a person can do by codifying some of the tools of meaningful communication. And where I really start to lead from this is so much of what has influenced how I communicate in the world is really coming from this place of authenticity, emotional awareness, and truth. And how do you codify a framework for communication, conflict resolution, meaningful conversation that is really starting from this place of like everyone can be fully honest and transparent about what they're feeling, and that we can do this in a context that doesn't take us away from the work, but just makes us more capable to solve important problems and do our best work. And I'm really excited about it. So I'm like leading offsites for companies, leading workshops on relational leadership, and really starting to codify the materials. It just says, hey, if you were going to give this to every single person on your team to provide them with an actual framework of here's how we talk to each other when we're working through an issue, here's how we present information so that it's most compelling, people are most able to receive it. Here's how we start conversations with new people in the way that's going to lead to the deepest connection. And you're just creating a shared framework of how we do this essential thing to connect and create in the world. And so that is the relational leadership.
Is there anything, Andrew, that we haven't spoken about so far today that you'd like to bring into the conversation now? And if not, I have just a couple more questions for you.
Cool. I mean, I'm curious, have you found meaning in your life?
Have I found meaning in my life? Absolutely. Yes, I've found meaning in my life. If you want me to expound on that, I'm happy to share more about it.
Yeah. What's most meaningful in your life?
Well, I mean, what you're explaining about relational leadership, like the through line of everything that matters most in my life. If I go through my gratitude journal, if I think about the moments that had the biggest impact on my life, it's when I feel most connected to myself, when I have most connection to other people, when I'm engaged in my work, when I'm engaged in play, when I'm engaged in really any domain of my life. I'm connected to the food I'm eating. I'm connected to really being here in the moment. That meaning isn't a place that I'm going. It's something that I'm cultivating each and every moment. And I have to remind myself of this a lot, because as you were talking about shame and not enoughness, I was thinking about all the ways that I'm constantly chasing, and I want validate. I want the most podcast downloads. I want the most listeners. I want, whatever the benchmarks of success that I've been conditioned to believe are success. And what I keep coming back home to over and over again is that meaning is something that's personal to me, and that I can cultivate it in every single moment. And that word connection just comes up so much for me, that I really value when just able to be here and now with another person or be here and now with myself. And there's plenty more that I can say about that, but like that's ultimately what I'm up to in the world.
Good to hear it.
So the couple of questions I like to ask on the back end here. So I would love to know where you feel most unfinished right now, and or an edge that you're leaning into.
Where do I feel most unfinished? Where I feel most unfinished would be with the Institute for Relational Leadership, because it's like the very beginning stages. You know, I'm launching copy on a website today and starting to go public. So where I feel unfinished is, someone asked me a similar question this way recently. It was at a YPO dinner, and the question was, what do you know you should do that if you didn't do, you would regret it? And I had a weird response, which is, I want to build a big company, which at face value, I was like, that's weird. Like, why would you want to build a big company? And what I thought about was that, for so long, again, entrepreneurship to me was another method of seeking external validation. So many of the people around me were starting really cool companies and making a lot of money. And for me, it's, again, I think young founders do this, is they want to define themselves by what it is that they create. And I think it's important that if you want to define yourself by what it is you create, like consciously go for it. But I was really doing that unconsciously, and that so much of my enoughness was tied to the success of my commercial ventures and businesses. And so what was interesting is that even with something like Tribute, which is a company that I love and I'm deeply proud of, what's interesting is now from, just the place of consciousness that I'm currently operating from, is this idea that one of the reasons that I want to build a company is really to continue to develop these tools for people who I get to invest in really deeply, and in a vehicle that really can transform how people connect and create in the world. And so where I feel unfinished is in a body of work there that is really deserves to exist, and that is really clear in my mind. And I think that what's fun, it's like, when I think about all the things that I still have to build that I'm so clear on, there are so many. And I really believe that I will birth all of these projects into the world that are things that I really hope and believe will live on long after I'm here, and that I have found a lot of value in personally, and that I hope and believe other people will find value in as well. And so I feel really unfinished there. And like the feeling of being unfinished kind of engineers this like awareness of like, oh wow, there's just like so much meaningful work to do in front of me. And I think what's really beautiful is that I don't delude myself that life will get any better when I have created those things. Mm-hmm. And that's a rare place that I've never really been able to create from, is this idea that there are successes that I have not achieved, impact that perhaps I haven't been able to manifest in the world. And I am excited to work towards those goals and to bust my ass and to hustle and to challenge myself. And I'm also just deeply aware of how fortunate I am to be in this body, and like to have the relationships that I have, to have the family that I have, to have the time that I have, and that I just like, I know that this is as good as it gets, and that it'll keep getting better. And so it's fun to create from that place of knowing.
Right on. So I'll make sure to link to all the places that people can connect with you in the show notes, the YouTube videos that you have, the podcast, your websites, all the different ways that people can connect with you. And the final question, I'm going to return the serve to you now. So I appreciate every now and then the guest asks me what it means to me to live a meaningful life. And I ask every single guest who comes on this show what it means to you. So what does it mean to Andrew Horn to live a meaningful life?
Yes, is to live a meaningful life is to recognize that you are alive. It's simply the recognition that you are alive, and the recognition that that is incredibly rare, and the appreciation of being able to experience anything at all. And so I think that like one, I do not need to search anywhere beyond that for life to be meaningful, because life in and of itself is a miracle. And like when I say that, there's a great Albert Einstein quote. He says that there's only two ways to experience life. Like one is that nothing is a miracle, and two is that everything is a miracle. And even through a scientific lens, right? Like we do not know what exists on the other side of the Big Bang. We do not know how consciousness emerged. So for any of this to be happening, it requires, in my experience, some layer of belief. And the fact that it's happening is incredible. I'm deeply grateful for it. And when I'm tapped into that awareness, I don't need to look for a whole lot to know that life is meaningful, because I get to experience it. And whatever I do on top of that is meaningful.
I think this calls for holy shit, we're alive.
Holy shit, we're alive. Amen, brother.
Well, Andrew, I really appreciate your presence. I mean, right from the get-go in this interview, your willingness to go right in it. I already felt safe with you. I've been enrolled in who you are and what you're up to in the world since I first encountered your work. And, it's not lost on me, just the reason I was willing to drop in and go deep for my audience here was, on some level, I have the courage to do so, but I really felt like I was in good hands with you. And that was what was real for me in that moment. I really was feeling like I'm blocked up, and I want Andrew to think this is a really powerful experience. And I appreciate it.
I think I'm sorry. I think I might have lost you. Thank God it happened towards the end here, but I heard you say that you felt safe.
Yes. Yeah. And I wanted to just let you know how safe I felt, that despite having gone there several times, that it's not easy for me to just open up about the fear and the shame that I'm experiencing, and my insecurities about really wanting people to like me.
Yeah.
And when you ask me what it means to live a meaningful life, I mean, one of the most meaningful experiences that I can ever have is that all of me is welcome.
Yeah.
And not just knowing that and hearing it intellectually, but really feeling that. And that when I was going there, the look that I saw on your face and the way that you were able to hold me is so beautiful, and is something that clearly a lot of people and a lot of men are really hungry for. And my hope is that audience members were able to hitch a ride with us. And I got so much from this conversation. I've really enjoyed getting to know more about you and what you're up to in the world, and just really deeply in gratitude for you being here and sharing this last almost 2 hours with me.
Well, thanks, brother. I think that when you can say those words, that all of me is welcome, that you energetically show everyone else that all of them is welcome. And I felt that, and I hope that your audience did it well and does. So thank you for the time and the great questions and curiosity. And I look forward to putting this in the world and seeing where it goes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So to everyone who is listening, I hope that you do realize all of you is welcome here. Wishing you a wonderful rest of your day or evening whenever you're listening, and sending you lots of love. Take care. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen to Mike's Search for Meaning. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, share this episode with your friends, and leave a review. I look forward to seeing you next time, my friends. And until then, stay safe, stay well, and keep living with purpose. Peace.